Talk Genealogy, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands. Here's your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
The Vicissitudes of Families was a series of essays written by the Victorian genealogist Bernard Burke. They were collected and published in different editions, and in this episode I want to catch the romance of Burke's work and point out its relevance to today's family history enthusiasts. Welcome to episode 8 of the series of podcasts for genealogists with too much time on their hands. My thanks to everyone who's been in touch since the last podcast, and thank you for being there this evening. I'm Malcolm Noble, and tonight we're looking at Vicissitudes of Families by Bernard Burke. Before we go any further, I'd like to remind you that I am neither a professional nor an expert. I'm an enthusiast, like you, who has spent more than 50 years digging up his family tree, and these podcasts are really no more than me sharing with you some of the lessons which I've learned during those years. I also need to stress that I'm talking about searching for ancestors in England. And there is something of a personal edge to this evening's subject. Back in the 1960s, I would have been 12 years old, something like that. I was spending a couple of weeks with my grandparents, and in a back bedroom, which hadn't been disturbed probably for years, I found a broken copy of Burke's Vicissitudes of Families. I had no idea what vicissitude or genealogy meant, but I did catch sight of a heading, the Doomsday Book, and, thanks to my Ladybird history books for younger readers, I certainly knew about the Normans and Doomsday. At the time, I considered the Norman invaders the enemy, but hey, family history research can change your attitude, you know. Burke described the different Doomsday books, the Battle Abbey roll, something I couldn't read, but obviously meant something about monasteries, and plenty of other sources, including pipe rolls written on vellum. I didn't need to understand what a pipe roll or vellum were. The sound of them was enough. By the time I had finished that essay on the landmarks of genealogy, I was hooked. But at that stage I wasn't attracted so much by the prospect of tracing a pedigree back to early England. No, it was the thought of England's history being preserved in dusty, handwritten documents, kept in vaults and chests and, well, who really knew where? And it all wasn't kept locked up by the government. Burke got across his feeling that it was all around us, and all we had to do was find it. Now, on page 1 of his introduction, he wrote, "They lie for the most part scattered about in unread chronicles and private papers, overwhelmed, buried, as it were, under the dryness and the weight of the superincumbent materials, from which they must be disinterred and the dust swept off, before they can be fitly presented to the public at large." As a 12-year-old, that was just what I wanted to hear. I didn't ask for my grandfather's copy, and over the years I suppose 3 or 4 copies in various conditions have passed through my hands. Some time ago I settled on a nice half-leather copy of the 4th edition. Not the most complete. Generally speaking, the later the edition, the better. But I'm pretty sure the contents matched that first experience, so it's enough. Now, before we talk about the book, here are a few words about Burke. Regular followers of the podcast will know that I like to include profiles of the early genealogists. We've done one on Dugdale, of course, he's the father of modern genealogy, and another on W.E. Tate. John Southern Burns is already recorded and waiting for a slot in the calendar. But now, if we're going to provide a Burke profile, we would need to feature the family over successive generations rather than one person. Bernard Burke, who wrote the Vicissitudes, was a son of John Burke, who brought together the Burke's peerage. Bernard was much involved in delivering the peerage during his lifetime. He was a London-born barrister who was 39 when appointed to Ulster King of Arms, He was knighted, and within 2 years he was Keeper of the Queen's Papers in Ireland. His family had a strong Irish background, and he was living in Dublin when he died, 3 weeks short of his 78th birthday. With that background, it's hardly surprising that Irish genealogy and families feature quite strongly in his writing. However, when we look at the titles of his work, for example, The Romance of the Aristocracy and The Romance of the Forum, we can see that Burke very much promoted the richness of genealogy. Now let's have 20 seconds of music before we delve into vicissitudes. Can I remind you that the show notes for this and previous episodes can be found on the website talkgenealogy.wordpress.com. And here is the place to mention that we're changing the name of the podcast to match that website. Calling it the Talk Genealogy Podcast will make things easier, of course, although during the transition, the podcast will still be searchable under the old name. I hope that it won't cause too much confusion. Indeed, the idea is it should cause less, and thank you to Andrew for the suggestion. Perhaps I can share with you what has just happened. As you might be able to picture, I turned the microphone off while I settled in my armchair to talk through the book. But Vicissitudes is such a compelling read that once you sink into it, it can capture you. So now we're starting part 2 of this podcast, 40 minutes after the end of part 1. And in those missing minutes, I've been absorbed once again in the subject of tonight's talk. His essays in Vicissitudes recounted, as you may expect, social mobility as families rose through good fortune before later generations falling down the scale. And here I want to apologise for any unfortunate connotation when I talk about class. I feel very uneasy about it myself, but I do intend it as a shorthand for the different states of wealth. I'm certainly not suggesting that one branch of your family tree is better than the other, or more worthy. It's just the way things were, and probably the way things are. Often Burke focused on the plight of forgotten female lines, driven to marry beneath themselves. Here he writes of the Cromwells, just 4 generations from Oliver, hero of the Civil War. Of the daughters of Elizabeth Cromwell and William Russell, the eldest, Elizabeth, married Robert Day of Soham, a gentleman of ancient family who dissipated his fortune and became so reduced that he died in a workhouse, leaving his widow, the great-granddaughter of the Lord Protector, dependent on an annual present from the daughters of Richard Cromwell. This ceasing towards the latter years of her life, she endured the severest hardships and the bitterest penury. She survived until 1765. Her only surviving daughters were both married, one to Thomas Addison, a shoemaker at Soham, and the other to one Saunders, a butcher's son, who was a fellow servant in the house in which she lived. Mary, the 4th daughter of Elizabeth Cromwell and William Russell, was left a poor, destitute, and forsaken child in the village of Fordham, until Charles Wager, who purchased her ancestral estate of Fordham Abbey, heard about her miserable condition and had her educated. Eventually she married a Mr. Martin Wilkins, a respectable resident of Soham, and died without children. The 5th daughter formed a very humble connection, and the youngest married Mr. Nelson of Mildenhall, by whom she had a son and a daughter who, after the death of her husband, kept school in Mildenhall. How pointedly does this story of the downfall of Oliver Cromwell's family tell of the instability of all human greatness. Within the scope of a single century, and after the lapse of a few generations, we find the descendants of one who in power equalled the mightiest princes on the earth, reduced to the depths of poverty and almost begging for their daily bread. Burke tells the story of notable families who suffer the fortunes of war, the loss of a patron, younger generations who didn't come up to scratch, and not enough name-carrying heirs to go round. He takes us through the Nevilles, the Percys, the Buckinghams and others. The names differ from edition to edition. But when you read the essays as a collection, you can see that his narratives about particular families, his case studies if you like, a terrible term, are really no more than entertainments. Perhaps they are intended as enticements. Burke was showing us that quite ordinary families in modern days might be linked to the well-documented families of centuries gone by. In that way, he was inviting us to play with the bug for family history research. If you remember, in the last podcast, I said that we can imagine ourselves reaching back with our research, while the histories of documented families are reaching forward with their wills, tax returns and property records. I think Burke was getting at the same thing. He was reminding us how natural it is for different branches of a posh family tree to fall through the different classes below. There is never enough money to go round, especially in a society that favours, though not exclusively, the eldest son. I tend to use a shorthand of the knightly class, what we might call middle class, descending to the gentlemen, who did not work with their hands, and the yeoman class, which has many disputed definitions, but I use it as the primary farmer or farmers in a parish. And they sit above the skilled and labouring class. The whole point, which Burke makes clear, is that the divisions are not watertight and do overlap. That's why it works. Here I would like to introduce the work of Anthony Wagner, who used to work at the College of Arms and indeed was Garter King at one stage. And I'd like to draw on one or two of his comments about social mobility. He reminds us that the further we go back, the labouring class becomes a smaller proportion of the population. Now, it may take us a few minutes to get our heads around that. I know I had to puzzle through it. Indeed, they are a smaller proportion of a smaller population. Let's turn that on its head. In medieval times, what we would call middle class were a greater proportion of the population. That's good news for us. He also reminds us that a labourer in 1830 was more likely to be the grandson of a yeoman or craftsman than we might expect. I'm sure most of us have seen that family tree which fits a King of England and an innkeeper on the same page. This social mobility is crucial in our attempt to bridge our Tudor generations with their medieval forefathers. Let's look at the easy pathway. Well, it should be easy, but I know it rarely works out as I'm going to map it. Initial research, that's talking to people, family documents and one or two inquiries, might take us back to the 1851 census. That's a good first goal. It was the earliest census to include the age and place of birth, and so could, or might, fingers crossed, take us back to the parish where our family lived in the 18th century before they moved to the towns. Perhaps you recognise at least part of that. So we're now in the rural economies where a family might not move beyond the next but one parish, say 30 miles. Yes, loads of exceptions. That's why list of strays are so important. But it does seem to have been a general pattern, a rough rule of thumb, before the Industrial Revolution. So, with luck, our family will have been fairly settled in the rural parishes where the registers trundle back through the generations until that source runs dry, usually in the latter part of the 16th or early 17th centuries. It's as if our research has been on an expressway. and now we're left with hardly a farm track. The family tree nut feels abandoned. Now, our quest is to identify connections between those classes that occur in the more remote stage of our family tree. Some people would say that we're looking for a gateway ancestor, a grandparent who will ferry us back to those better documented generations. But I've always thought of them as one of Burke's family strays. Very often this means looking for a link between the skilled and labouring branches to a yeoman branch. Well, step 1 is to select a promising line within your pedigree. Anthony Wagner argues that 4 clues indicate how easy it is going to be to trace a pedigree back to an early time. Property, continuity, name and record. They each deserve a bullet point. Owners of property are more likely to appear in public and parish records. No doubt about that. Award maps, transfers, legal disputes, taxations and wills are more likely to be relevant where property is an element than where it is not. I believe that Wagner's second element, continuity, is really important. Continuity not only of place or trade, but anything else, always seems to accelerate research. Well, almost always. Where a family is continuously recorded in a lost or inaccessible source, nonconformity for an example, we can be grateful when a family member breaks with tradition and unlocks a puzzle by appearing in a more common source. But generally, continuity is a damn good friend of the genealogist. When we come to discuss the third requirement, name, I begin to disagree a little bit with Wagner. He says that where a name is concerned, advantage is all with rarity. So an uncommon surname not only sticks out like a sore thumb, but also indicates a likely connection between the branches of the family. He uses the example of the Vesti family, who had difficulty in proving a Samuel Vesti in Manchester was the same Sam Vesti in Leicestershire. After extensive searching, showed no other Samuel Vestis, and indeed very few Vestis at all, I mean only a handful countrywide, the genealogist was able to argue and convince the College of Arms, if not him, who? I would whisper, rather timidly, someone who wasn't written down. But Wagner also gives examples where making assumptions about unusual surnames commonly held has led people down the wrong path. However, my main point is that a popular surname in a parish or cluster of parishes helps us build up a broad picture which might well fill in some of the gaps. But Wagner does make a good point when he encourages us to look not only for surnames, but also duplicated given names, and patterns of names given to siblings, are not only on the male side, but, especially relevant to this evening's talk, in the female ancestry. And finally, Wagner concedes that our success may be limited by the accessibility and survival of records, often a matter of luck, if not weather or enemy action. It seems to me that as more and more sources are coming available to us through digitisation, this need not be the showstopper that it used to be, although folk can only digitise what has survived. But I think mention of record really should push us to make full use of all those sources that are available to us nowadays. Now, Wagner is telling us that property, continuity, name and record were indicators of how profitable research was likely to be. But you know, I keep using them as a checklist in my mind. Have I checked for property holding? Have I looked for continuity of trade, place or anything else, and name patterns? Have I made full use of all available records? Property, continuity, name and record. Now let's return to Burke's volume. His meteor essays are on heraldry, county recollections, an essay that lasts for more than 80 pages in my edition, record repositories, and, as I've already mentioned, an excellent discourse on the landmarks of genealogy. Why are these instructional pieces still relevant today? Well, first, they are written from a Victorian perspective, and so survive with a historical interest in their own right. For the family history nut, they show us where genealogy has come from, or rather come through, and they can be strangely reassuring when they show that the issues that bother us today worried those family historians who travelled before us. But I want to focus on a different element. Some followers to this podcast have mentioned that I seem to have little time for internet sources. Now, that's not the case, although I am always concerned to know where the information comes from. But the internet develops so quickly that I wouldn't want to give advice about the net, because any advice I give is likely to be outdated so soon. I like to emphasise that all those databases, streams, transcripts and whatever that appear on your screen must have been taken from the same primary sources that we were using years ago, that Burke was using largely. I guess DNA and disembargoed papers are the exception. So isn't it better, and certainly more fun, more satisfying, to gain an understanding of those primary sources so that we know what we're asking our keyboard keys to deliver? And even when Burke talks about record repositories that are no longer there, he is still colouring in the traditions of our passion. Here he is telling us about wills and admins, but listen to how he brings it alive at the end of this passage. He writes, "I now come to the principal and often only records by which families in the middling classes of life can trace any descent prior to the introduction of parochial records. I refer to wills and administrations. Few, if any, documents contain so great amount of genealogical detail, for the testaments of men of property almost invariably name 2 and frequently 3 or 4 clear descents, and refer to relations and kindred who could never otherwise be attached to the pedigree. Made at a solemn and impressive moment, and with a feeling of sanctity of the instrument, they are scarcely ever inaccurate or false, and in perusing their details, we seem to hear again the voice and the words of the departed, telling his own story and referring to facts of other times, with all the truth and certainty which personal knowledge can impart. We know that we would be so foolish to ignore the work of these early genealogists. We have a lot to thank them for, certainly, but many of them were full-timers and old-timers, and in many senses they wrote the rules of the game that we play by today. They developed the discipline of properly sourced evidence proving one step at a time, and if they steer us in one direction rather than another, it is because they learned by their mistakes, so why shouldn't we? Of all his books, Bernard Burke is best remembered for this one. It went through several editions and without doubt prompted many readers to wonder about their family history. I think it was successful because it allowed the readers to be no more than spectators of genealogy if that's what they wished. But then it opened the door if they wanted to take up the passion themselves. He nicely supplemented the tasty product of genealogical research with a map of the landscape should you want to explore for yourself. But he never approached anything didactic, so the readers stayed with him. And he wrote excellently, carefully weaving strings of facts with all their reservations and byways into comfortable and certainly not convoluted prose. Thank you for listening to episode 8 of the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands. Please get in touch if you have any thoughts or comments or a family history story you'd like to tell. Can I remind you that the show notes for tonight's episode can be found on talkgenealogy.wordpress.com. The next episode will be posted at 7:30 UK time on the 3rd of April. My word, the year is going by too fast. My thanks to Freeze Effects for the music, Emily Brooks for the voiceover, and thank you for listening. Good night, and God bless. Hi, this one's a quick 30-second update for followers of my Talk Genealogy podcast, with a look at the reshaped website. On the front page, tabs for the show notes of the recent episodes are clearly displayed. There are links to the audio podcast, of course. And now additional tabs for 2 new pages. The bibliography brings together the details of all the books mentioned into one place. Several are mentioned in more than one episode. And there's a page for me to share particular thoughts of the moment about genealogy. This one concerns the Place Name Society and Frank Stenton. My thanks to everyone whose comments led to these improvements. It's nice to know that you're there and joining in. The web address is unchanged, talkgenealogy.wordpress.com. Our forthcoming episodes, by the way, are the 3rd of March, The Vicissitudes of Families, drawing on the work of Bernard Burke. And the 3rd of April, we'll have 30 minutes on working with the medieval pipe rolls. Thanks for listening. I hope you'll be there to catch them.